Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saviryam Karavavahi Tejasvina Vadhitamastu Ma Vidvidishavahi. Good morning to one and all. Let me at the outset express my sincere gratitude to very respectable and the person who is behind this successful event so far, Professor Suresh Kumar Agrawal ji, for his kind invitation. I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Manoj Kumar ji, Dr. Seema Sharma ji, and the moderator of this plenary session, Professor Umesh Singh ji, and my fellow speakers, elderly brother-like figure, Dr. Dhananjay Singh ji and Joshi ji. Well, from where I should begin? It's a $1,000,000 question. But I would like to begin from Etre Brahman. The topic which I have chosen, it's something which is related to translation of Munshi Premchand's Godan. And I think most of us very much aware about Premchand ji and his wonderful krati, that is Godan, with us. So if I would speak about them, it would be injustice to both the creator and the creation that we have. So I would like to stick to the time as well as to the focal area of my, this research. So I would like to extend whatever already said by Professor Dhananjay Singh, that it's something which is retelling. So Etre Brahman, there is a saying, Utidanuvadim Kuryat. What does it mean? That whatever is already said, you have to retell it, or it is retelling of whatever is already there in the source language. I don't like to go into the technical details or technicalities of source language or target language and all these things. But if you don't go far away, there you have the Yask. And Yask in his Nirukta very well or aptly said, Kalanuvad Paritaya. Whatever is already known, if it is going to be told, it is called Anuvad, to be very honest. And it is a mere repetition of what is already in existence. And similarly, you go to the chapters of the Ashta Adhyay, and in fact, we are blessed by the gurus like Agarwal Sahab or even Kapil Kapoor Sahab. So we have all these, concepts and notions in our mind. In Panini's Ashta Adhyay, you have a very good saying, Anuvad Charanam. That means what? That is whatever is Gyat and that you are going to retell, it is Anuvad. So we have Munshi Premchand's Godan in our hands now. And at this particular backdrop or in this background, I tried to analyze Premchand Godan. And I came across with a very good word that I like to use and I like to explain before application of this particular term. So the word that I came across, it's something like Professor Dhananjay Singh. I was listening to him. It's a wonderful deliberation, and he was talking about actual pratibha, and all these things are correlated when you talk about this particular word, translanguaging. And some of you might have already heard about this word, translanguaging. And what does it mean? Because there are some scholars are also there. So let me tell you very honestly, this is something which we have taken from the pedagogical. It's something which is from the learning process. That utilizing it, you do in your classes. We do this particular practice in our classroom. Utilizing more than one language within a classroom. So whenever you have a translation or work of any translator, you will come across with this particular issue of translanguaging. And it is not something which is transliteration or transcreation. As Professor Dhananji was actually, he was very correct when he pinpointed out. Even he referred Arbindo, Vivekanandji, and Bhagavad Gita, and all these things are not transcreation, transliteration, and I think these things are very close to the term that I'm presenting before you, translanguaging. That means using more than one language in a particular translated work. And since the paucity of time, I'm not going to read out from anything in my paper that I have written, but I like to pinpoint certain areas, key areas, the focal areas of paper. And almost everybody aware about the birth and death of our kalam ke dhani, or Munshi Premchand, Dhanpat Rai, or all these things are there. Upanyas Samrat. When he was born, 31st July 1880, Lamahi, near Varanasi, which is near Banaras in UP, and died in 1936. The novel, it was published in 1936. Now, why I'm talking all these things? Because this is only an extension of whatever Professor Dhananjay Singh ji has said. The freedom fighter, freedom movement, it was going in between this particular period of time. You see the Indian freedom struggle movement from 1920 to almost 35 or 34. You should go and you will find 1920 the non-cooperation movement. It started in India, and it spread just like a wildfire across pan India. Then people, they started leaving all those what you call the foreign objects, or people like to adopt Swadeshi, the indigenous culture. It has come into practice. Indigenous objects, they come into practice. And from 1929, you found another revolution when Mahatma Gandhi started, that Dandi March. So Premchand is a writer. He was definitely affected by all these, development, and he came along with a krati, a creation known as Godan. So I don't like to, narrate this story here, Hori, who was Gobar, Dhania, and all those things. But to be very honest, if I would be keeping these characters in my mind, my work of presenting this particular aspect of the research will be very easy, and it will be understood by all of you. So you see what I have covered. I tried to cover in a very short span of time. The first translation of Godan, it was done, or it was attempted by Jai Singh and P. Lal, and it was after around 21 years of the publication of Godan.
Professor Agrawal, some snag has developed, I think, because we are not able to hear Professor Naveen Kumar Mehta right now.
Naveen sir?
Sorry for the loss.
Yes, sir. Please continue.
I think Godan. So Godan is something which is the donation of cow, and it is considered very sacred in our culture, in our tradition. And if you translate it in gift of cow, the whole meaning it got disturbed. Like religion, we called it dharma. It has been translated into religion, and the translated word has got no significance as per our context. Dharma rakshati rakshata, जो धारण करते हैं धर्म है, तो ट्रांसलेटर का भी धर्म है, उसका धर्म है कि उसकी सेंटिटी को बरकरार रखे. तो गोदान का जो ट्रांसलेशन हम दो चीजों में देखते हैं. वी फाउंड देम इन दी वर्क्स ऑफ दी जय सिंह and the other work of P. Lal in 1957. Now the second translation, it came into practice, and I think this is the crux of this story. A foreigner, a person from foreign, he translated the work, and till time and date, it is considered one of the best translated works of Godan. And the person was, you might be aware, because the English people are here, and they have this particular translated work in their syllabi also. And that translation was done by whom? Uh, and he was the Gordon Charles, and it was done in 1968 after 11 years of P. Lal and Jay Singh's translation. Don't go far away. Another translation it came into practice, and this time by a person whose name was Peter France. Peter France. And the fourth then came into light, into practice by Dinesh Kumar and Madan in 1996. And the last two translations, they were done by Muhammad Majar in 2005. Why I have taken this particular? Because, see the author's biography. I don't like to go, I like to take to you, into the deconstruction theory, all those things. Otherwise, you can correlate all these things. Author's biography is also very important at times, because basically Premchand started writing in Urdu, and his command over Urdu is very, very, excellent. So you find Urdu words, Farsi, Arabic words, each and everywhere in the pages of Godan. Therefore, if you don't take this translation into consideration, you will be far away from knowing the real essence of Godan as a translated work. So you could take him also. Then Anurag Yadav. It's something which is done recently, and it is done in 2009. So you see how many translated works are there. And what I have done, I will take you, since the paucity of time, please consider that I am not going to go into any details of the translated or that word I have used initially at the deliberation, but I would like to focus on the social titles that we have in the novel. So one example I would like to take. You find that at that particular phase of history of India, there was a particular word, and that word, it was Jamidar. It was Jamidar, and you translate it. It's something which is related to landlord, landowner, landlord, given an estate by the British government in exchange for fixed annual revenues. You see the word Jamidar, and then the reference or the definition of it in the terms of the British government. So Premchand, I think you find it in rendering Jamidar a general word, like as landlord. It looks like very ordinary word, or landowner. Will marginalize the socio-historical, socio-political, social-economical issues. One word, it creates all the problem. It makes the person like Hori, Gobar, Dhania very poor in the hands of Jamidar. Because the word Jamidar, it is related to something that collects revenue and that exploits the people. It's not the landlord or your Makan Malik like type of person. He exploits poor people, especially the peasants, the farmers, the poor, the downtrodden people, the people from the lower class of the society. So you find it that the novel touches upon a number of social systems, noted in the caste system, and then the religion and the British rule, with giantly ensure that farmers and the laborers in colonial India, as Professor Dhananjay Singh, he was talking about the colonization and all those things. And then the decolonization process can be initiated through the translation. How? So that is not my cup of tea. I'm not going to include, because I have to restrict myself to the Premchand's Godan only. So in the laborers in colonial India to remain exploited. So what I like to put forth, the word that I have focused in my research, and that word is lathi. The word lathi I have taken, and I like to quote from the original text. सुनते हैं क्या बोलता है होरी? होरी ने दोनों बेलों को साना पानी देकर अपनी स्त्री धनिया से क्या कहा? गोबर को उख खोड़ने भेज देना, मैं जाने कब लौटूं, जरा मेरी लाठी दे दो. ये बड़ा कॉमन ये स्टेटमेंट है. The ग्रामीण परिवेश में, you go to the rural areas and you will find whenever you have a farmer, and the time comes for him to to reach to his farm or that agricultural land, he would utter in the same fashion कि भाई मैं जा रहा हूं, मुझे लाठी दे दो. अब ये लाठी वर्ड बड़ी समस्या खड़ी करता है ट्रांसलेशन के लोगों के लिए. मैं वो देखना चाहता हूं कि रतन लाल जी का जो ट्रांसलेशन है वो कहता है, उसका मैं भावानुवाद करता हूं अंग्रेजी में. आफ्टर सर्विंग द 2 bullocks with feed and water, Hori said to his wife, यहां तक तो कोई गड़बड़ नहीं. Send Gobar to bow the sugar cane. I am going out and may return late. Hand me the stuff. Sorry, STA. अब बताइए, लाठी थी हमारे प्रेमचंद जी को प्यारी, हमारे भाई रतन एंड लाल ने कर दिया इसे स्टफ या स्टॉप कर दिया. तो आगे बढ़ते हैं. रोडरमल्स का ट्रांसलेशन मैंने पहले ही कहा है, वो एक आइकॉनिक ट्रांसलेशन माना जाता है. तो वो क्या कहते हैं वो भी सुन लेते हैं जरा. Hori finished feeding his 2 bullocks and then returned to his wife Dhania. Send Gobar to bow the sugar cane. I don't know when I will back. Just get my stick. अब लाठी से स्टिक हो गई. स्टिक का मतलब आप समझ गए, छड़ी दीजिए मुझे मारने के लिए. और महात्मा गांधी यदि हम फ्रीडम स्ट्रगल में वी आर देयर समवेयर इन बिटवीन, ही ऑलवेज कीप दैट लाठी विथ हिम. अब ये वो लाठी, ये लाठी कौन सी लाठी? तो
Professor Naveen Kumar Mehta ji,
yeah.
I'm just interrupting you because I have been assigned an unpleasant task of managing the time. So would you please come to the conclusion?
Only 1 minute. I'm finishing, sir. I will definitely finish before the deadline. I keep that factor. Thank you very much for reminding me that. Hori, then Lal's translation again, and he called it Ghazal, Cudgel, Cudgel, Ghazal. So now Lathi has got so many things. And Gandhiji never used Lathi as a weapon. But here the farmer is using Lathi not as a stick, not as a Ghazal, but as part of, to support himself, or not even to support, if in case if there is any animal or something, anything like wolf है, भेड़िया है, कुत्ता आ जाए तो भगाने के लिए, जानवर को खदेड़ने के लिए. So you have this particular interpretation whenever you come across with any creative work like Premchand's Godan. Translation, it becomes difficult at times, and therefore the translators are very clever. They have applied this particular terminology, translanguaging in translation. So I hope that whatever I like to communicate, I have communicated within the limited time frame. Let me thank you again to the organizing committee, especially my guru, Professor Suresh Agrawal ji, for giving me this opportunity to deliver my presentation within the time frame. Thank you one and all. I hope that whatever I explained, whatever I tried to cover up, I covered. If any question arises, you are most welcome.
Thank you, sir. Sir, am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Honorable Chair, Mr. Dhananjay Singh ji, my fellow respected participants and fellow speakers in the session. Indeed, it's a great privilege for me to share my thoughts with this august assembly of intellectuals, I must say. The topic of my talk is Hindustan and Hindustani, a linguistic trope. That means I'm trying to understand the idea of freedom, the national freedom, or the freedom struggle from the linguistic and cultural perspective. That's why I've used the word Hindustan and Hindustani. In fact, this idea came to me to have such a topic when I was going through a book by eminent Hindi writer Hajari Prasad Dwivedi ji. The name of his book is Bhasha, Sahitya aur Desh. And second source for my inspiration was an article published in the Hindu newspaper on Hindustani. So these are the 2 points of reference, or I could call them source of inspiration for me, which made me to think on these lines of understanding freedom struggle through a linguistic perspective. In fact, Indian freedom struggle, and if I could call it its consequential product, that is partition of Bharat as India and Pakistan, they are not merely geographical division or geographical entities as such. We all know that partition was executed based on political, religious, and linguistic grounds. So, my primary concern while developing this talk is to understand the linguistics of Indian freedom movement. And to do this, as I have said earlier, I referred the book Bhasha, Sahitya aur Desh by eminent Hindi writer Hajari Prasad Dwivedi ji. Hajari Prasad in his book says that भारत वर्ष का जो कुछ श्रेष्ठ है, जो कुछ उत्तम है, जो कुछ रक्षणीय है, वह संस्कृत भाषा के भंडार से संचित किया गया है. Let me repeat these lines. भारत वर्ष का जो कुछ श्रेष्ठ है, जो कुछ उत्तम है, जो कुछ रक्षणीय है, वह संस्कृत भाषा के भंडार से संचित किया गया है. Please do not mistake me or Hajari Prasad Dwivedi ji as an advocacy for Sanskrit language. No, at least I am not advocating for Sanskrit language that way. In fact, Hajari Prasad Dwivedi ji was trying to define the idea of Hindustan through linguistic prism. He further says in the book, हिमालय से सेतु बंध तक सारे भारतवर्ष के धर्म, दर्शन, विज्ञान, चिकित्सा आदि विषयों की भाषा कुछ वर्ष पहले तक एक ही रही है. हिमालय से सेतु बंध तक सारे भारतवर्ष के धर्म, दर्शन, विज्ञान, चिकित्सा आदि विषयों की भाषा कुछ वर्ष पहले तक एक ही रही है. Again, it is not about Sanskrit language. It's about tracing a common linguistic thread running through the idea of Hindustan. My dear friends, language is a dynamic entity. We all understand it. It is not a static concept. It's a dynamic concept. The nature of language is to evolve. Eminent Indian philosopher Bhartari, he has said that language constructs our world. भाषा हमारे संसार का निर्माण करती है. We take cognizance of the world through word. And the best part in this philosophy is that language and thought are intertwined concepts. That means language is not merely a medium of communication. It is not merely an instrument for communication. In fact, language is the source for ideas. It is a source for thoughts. If I'm correct, Taittiriya Upanishad, I think, proclaims, he mentions this, that भाषा विचारों की जननी है और विचार भाषा के जनक हैं. भाषा विचारों की जननी है और विचार भाषा के जनक हैं. This kind of relationship exists between language and thought. Now, Indian freedom struggle was sustained through these ideas generated in several Indian languages, those bolis and dialects and vernaculars. This movement was sustained through those languages. And Hindustani is the convergence point for all those bolis and dialects. They all come and merge or converge as Hindustani. American linguist Edward Sapir, he says that language is a guide to social reality. Language is a guide to social reality. Now, Hindustani made us to see and realize the social reality of Indian Milu. Hindustani made us to realize this social reality of Indian Milu. Linguistic diversity of Hindustan acted as union of ideas, and translation acted as an instrument or facilitated for this union of ideas to emerge as national idea of independence or national idea of freedom struggle. Dialects and vernaculars, they had seminal ideas. Even today they have seminal ideas on liberty and freedom. Translation brought these ideas to the center. Translation made Hindustan to communicate and fight for a common cause. Translation as an act of communication is, always driven by meaning. That means translation is a meaning oriented process. It is never a medium driven process or medium oriented process. Unlike Western world, linguistic diversity of Hindustan acted as an instrument of unification and construction of Hindustan. That means our linguistic diversity, in fact, acted as an instrument of unification and to fight that common cause of freedom. Because of political and colonial reasons, a phase in Indian history witnessed Persian or Farsi as the language of Nyay, Rajniti, and Vyavhar. But for a Hindustani, for a typical normal Hindustani, हृदय की भाषा तो प्रांतीय भाषाएं हैं. That means the language of our hearts are always our local languages. और मस्तिष्क की भाषा मैं कहूँ तो संस्कृत रही है. Again, I would like to clarify it. I'm not advocating Sanskrit here, but let us understand and accept the fact that the source of knowledge systems, or you can say the mother of knowledge systems, or you can say the bedrock of knowledge systems, I think it has been, primarily it has been the Sanskrit language. And that means the bolis and dialects and our vernaculars, in fact, they became the source of these ideas to fight out this independence, or to sustain this freedom struggle. And translation acted as an instrument which brought these ideas to the center, and which acted as a platform to share these ideas across Hindustan. Ajari Prasad Dwivedi ji, again he says in the book, कई हजारों वर्षों तक भारत का ज्ञान विज्ञान, भारत के ज्ञान विज्ञान को, दर्शन अध्यात्म को, ज्योतिष चिकित्सा को, राजनीति व्यवहार को, कोश और व्याकरण को और उसकी समस्त चिंता को संस्कृत भाषा का ही सहारा मिला है. India has been a linguistically liberal country, which was further strengthened by translation. And translation acted as a catalyst to embolden the idea of freedom. Let me reiterate Bhartri once again when he says, Jagat sarvam shabdena bhashyate. We take cognizance of the world, as I said earlier, through words, and words are the translation of our ideas. That means every act of communication is in fact an act of translation. because our ideas get converted or get translated into somewhere into words. I think I can skip Noam Chomsky here. I wanted to, uh, uh, quote Noam Chomsky through his book Language and Freedom, where Chomsky correlates the idea of language and freedom, and somewhere he says that relation between language and freedom uh, is very original, very primary, because language is a process of free creation. Language, or especially your native language, your own language, makes you to create something very original and free. Along with Chomsky, Pinker, an American linguist, he also, in fact, says that each one of us, we are bound to have our native language because that gives us our identity. Coming straight to the maybe the second last phase of my paper, Hindustani, in fact, not Hindustan, Hindustani emerged as a Creole. In linguistics, we understand Pidgin and Creole, but Hindustani emerged as a Creole. It became a shared language because of its, that again, that linguistic notion of mutual intelligibility. Because of this qualification of mutually intelligible, it became a Creole for Hindustan, and in fact helped freedom struggle to move on. Its grammar of Hindustani is basically based on Khadi Boli dialect, and its lexis derives words and vocabulary from Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian, right? So, as I said, it's not about Sanskrit only. It's Hindustani is a Creole. It's a larger, you could say, linguistic entity because it has drawn lexis and grammar from different sources, and that's why we have heard Hindavi, Dakkini, Gujari, Rekhta, Urdu, and Hindi. These are again the sub-trends, or you can say different aspects of Hindustani. Poets like Mir Taki Mir and Ghalib, in fact, they didn't like using the word Urdu. They preferred Rekhta somewhere. Now, this divide of Hindi and Urdu, or you can say this division of Hindustani into Hindi and Urdu, in fact, again, it was a very well calculated, I should say, politically driven somewhere process of division of Hindustani, or looking at Hindustani as Hindi and Urdu. Uh, and primarily, script became the main reason for this division. Script of Hindi and script of Urdu. Uh, Institutions like Fort William College, which is Institute of Oriental Studies at Calcutta, then in fact was instrumental in carrying out this kind of I must call it division in the first place, because they undertook translations of classics through this Hindi and Urdu kind of you can say dichotomy, if I could say it that way. Then Nagari Pracharani Sabha, which was an alternative to this like then there was this Anjume Tariki Urdu, which was an alternative institution to Nagari Pracharani Sabha, and then Hindi Sahitya Sammelan 1910. So these were some of the institutions which, in fact, contributed in bifurcating Hindustani into Hindi and Urdu. And then gradually, somewhere, uh, recognition of Indian Urdu as a requirement for official or government jobs. Again, you can say consolidated the process of division of Hindustani into Hindi and Urdu, and you know Hindustani became Hindi and Urdu. Translation of Upanishads by Dara Sikho and translation of Mahadev Desai's uh, Gandhi's autobiography. These are two good examples to understand the process of translation. Dara Sikho's translation of Upanishad is an example of cultural translation. And Mahadev Desai's translation of Gandhi's autobiography is an example of discourse translation. I'm not into defining what are these two, cultural translation and you can say discourse translation, but translation definitely uh, helped freedom movement, freedom struggle to have strength and to unite Hindustan as one entity. Right? Coming to the last, to conclude, before I conclude, I would like you to ponder over what is Bharat ka Vyaktitva? What is this idea of Bharat, idea of Hindustan? Bharat ka Vyaktitva can be understood through four parameters. Vivekanand in Chicago, he said, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vandanti. That means, सभी मार्गों को सत्य मानकर उनका सम्मान करना. That is the first qualification of Bharat ka Vyakti. According to Tagore, विविधता के मूल में ही एकता की अनुभूति. That is Tagore's idea. विविधता के मूल में ही एकता की अनुभूति. प्रत्येक व्यक्ति में ईश्वर का अंश. एंड लास्ट वन, प्रत्येक व्यक्ति को मुक्ति का मार्ग चुनने का अधिकार. These four parameters of understanding what is Bharat or what is Hindustan. विवेकानंद says सभी मार्गों को सत्य मानकर उनका सम्मान. टैगोर, विविधता के मूल में ही एकता की अनुभूति. प्रत्येक व्यक्ति में ईश्वर का अंश और प्रत्येक व्यक्ति को मुक्ति का मार्ग चुनने का अधिकार. This is what is Bharat or Hindustan. To conclude, I am of the firm opinion that Indian freedom movement was in fact the unification movement. It was a moment of unification, bringing cultural cum linguistic diversity to the fore and turning the diversity as the instrument of unity, facilitated, of course, by translation. Since language is a cultural product, Hindustan and Hindustani are cultural tropes which cannot be subdued by nefarious and politically driven acts of Indo-Pak partition. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, sir,
Good afternoon.
and dear friends. I'm grateful to Professor S.K. Agarwal and Dr. Manoj Kumar for their their respective teams for giving me an opportunity to share my views with the galaxy of scholars in this panel and others who have already spoken and those who are going to speak in the coming sessions. I've decided to speak on Anand as were decided with Professor Agarwal. Uh, Before I come to the talk proper, I would like to mention a few facts about Anand Math. Anand Math was published in Bengali in a serial form. And my limitation happens to be that I am not a Bengali speaker, my mother tongue is not Bengali. And therefore, my paper largely deals with various translations and various translated versions of the book. So my book does not deal with the original sources, the primary sources in Bengali. And I'm told that the 6 translations of the book are available, but I have access only to 3, 1 in Hindi and 2 in English. So I shall be dealing with them only. And before I come to the paper, let me revise some of the facts about Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Nee Chatterjee. Now, this anglicization of Chattopadhyay to Chatterjee also needs to be paid attention to. After all, Bankim Chandra came from from an anglicized family. He was given his education, early education and later education in English. He was raised as an Englishman, And as was the trend in the uh, intellectual families of that particular time, many of his relatives had been converted to Christianity, and there was another prominent family that had migrated. Hmm. The next step of conversion happens to be leaving this country. That happened to be Datta family. So Datta family and this Chatterjee family, they were related in several ways. But Bankim Chandra started his first novel not in Bengali uh, but in English. And this was again a serialized novel, as was the trend in England also in that particular time. We are told that Dickens used to publish his novels serially. So, this once again is not a fact that needs to be ignored. After all, all this work was being done in imitation. And this novel that he published earlier was Rajmohan's Wife, and it is considered to be a socially realist novel, and it is generally argued that in India, social realist novels did not exist before Rajmohan's Wife, and that was the first attempt of imitating or borrowing a genre from English literature, and that was being attempted in Bengali at least for the first time. But this novel was never completed. And my thesis is that Bankim Chand realized the futility of this effort and he soon gave it up. And in place of keeping Jane Austen or Charles Dickens as the models, he switched over to another dimension of the novel, which is known as historical novels, but once again under the influence of another Englishman, Sir Walter Scott. Walter Scott, the students of English literature know, was a historical novelist from England, uh, almost a contemporary of Bankim Chand. But this time, Bankim Chand decided not to write this novel in English, but in Bengali. The book was extremely successful and attracted the attention of not only the Bengali people, but also all other intellectuals in different parts of the country. Uh, I am told that Bankim Chandra kept on editing the text in different editions, and particularly there is a debate about the word Yavan in that particular book. What is this word Yavan has been debated, because this Yavan word uh, in Sanskrit refers to all the Greeks. But the leftist scholars say that the book was being targeted against the Muslims. So, was it against the Muslims or was it against the British scholars, British rulers, the then British rulers, and also the connotations were there against the Muslim rulers that it has got to be seen. Uh, in which particular edition did this word Yavan figure in for the first time after changing it from Muslim to Yavan? I do not know. But I've learned from secondary sources that in the earlier editions, the word Muslim had been used. But till the time I do not have any access to the original sources, I cannot comment on that. But even if it was Muslim, or if it was Yavan, does it change the tone of the book, or does it help us in understanding the different tones? Now, the second fact that I shall be dealing with is whether this book has been hailed by the leftist and liberal scholars of this country as against the ethos of secular India, and they say it is a plea for giving Bharat Mata a concrete shape. Um, and Bharat Mata by this Bharat Mata, they mean to say that Hindu nationalism, the idea of Hindu nationalism, is being propagated through this particular book. But my thesis is that the book does not propagate any idea about Hindu nationalism. It is simply an outcry of the suffering people, whether they were suffering at the hands of the British people or they were suffering at the hands of the Muslims. Whatever the people were there, whenever they will feel that some impositions are being made on them, particularly uh, unjustified taxations or injustices are being perpetrated, naturally they will make a cry. And when the outcry will be there against the rulers, the various kinds of attributions will be made. After all, the leftist scholars have been trying to prove that the Muslim scholars have been very benevolent to the Hindus, and they were not discriminating between the British, they were not discriminating between Hindus and the Muslims, which once again happens to be a lie. uh, there are also scholars who say that the British people or the British rulers, they were also very generous in India. Various kinds of development programs had been started. If various kinds of development programs had been started, why this book deals with if a mean? After all, the conditions that have been that have been discussed in this book are a result of a famine. And if we study the famines in this country, we come to realize that after the arrival of the British, the frequency of famines in this country has suddenly increased. Naturally, this has got something to do with the policies that the then rulers were having about India, about India's agriculture, and about India's economic issues. Uh, the earlier speaker has already talked about Professor Dharampal's books, various histories. There is another important book that I will like to refer to here. That happens to be Sir Sundar Lal's Bharat Mein Angrezi Raj, a two-volume book that has been published by the publication division of India. In that book, not only Professor Sundar Lal, but even Dharampal Sahib in his various volumes, they have proved how systematically efforts were made to create a situation where the Indian agriculture was completely reoriented in order to give benefit to the industries that were coming up in Europe, and the emphasis on cash crops came. Anyway, the other fact that I would like to mention here is that there are only two stanzas from the song Bande Matram uh, that figures as a prayer in the book Anand Mat. Only two stanzas from this prayer have been accepted in our constitution, and they have been accepted as the national song. So was that a right decision on the part of the Constitution Assembly, or did they have access to the entire song in original, or they had access only to some translation? That also needs to be explored. Now this prayer has been it has been argued by the leftist scholars that this prayer basically happens to be a prayer to a Hindu goddess. But before Anand Mat, to my mind, there is no description of any Bharat Mata. If at all, that Bharat Mata, the idea of Mata has come into existence. So, what my thesis is that this Bharat Mata was a secular goddess. After all, this book that has been conceived in the light of Sannyasi Vidroh. And there are several historians who say that the Sannyasi Vidroh was not simply confined only to the Hindu saints, but even the Muslim saints were participating in that. So, if Muslim saints were also participating in the sannyasi Vidroh, meaning thereby that if they were praying, and if this book has been conceived in the light of this sannyasi Vidroh, meaning thereby that if the Muslims were Muslim saints uh, had got to be involved, and they could not be involved with the invocation of a Hindu goddess. So this Bharat Mata has been conceived as a secular goddess. After all, this Matrabhumi, this motherland, has got to be dear not only to a Hindu, it has also to be dear to a Muslim. It has also it has also to be dear to a Christian. Anybody who is living over there, he or she should first of all have allegiance to this country, to the motherland. So it is in the light of these facts that I have tried to do some work, and I've tried to compare some of the translations here and there. So the book has several chapters, and the first chapter happens to be the prologue, uh, Upokromanika. Hmm? And Bankim envisions here a world order or a societal construct based in the idea of the bhakti. Now, bhakti is not simply bhakti is not simply a Hindu idea. Bhakti also happens to be a Christian idea. Bhakti also happens to be a Muslim idea, particularly Sufi idea. Now, if if uh, there are people who are suffering, and the king, the highest and the mightiest power in the land, is not listening to them, there are only two options left: either they rise in revolt against that particular power, or they approach some other neighbor king, or they approach the god. Now, approaching god, bhakti, happens to be the easiest way, where they are seeking intervention from god. So this is my idea. And in Dharam Tattva, Bankim, another book of his, Bankim Chandra, he philosophizes this concept in detail. Hmm? And he says that Anandmat deals with this idea of bhakti as has been elaborated by him elsewhere. And he says that this means both devotion and a dedication to a particular ideology. Now, what is this ideology? This ideology happens to be the ideology of being devoted to one's motherland. There is nothing else, right? And there are various translations of this prologue, which, when compared, show how the words are interpreted in English to subtly achieve the desired effect of setting the scene and thereby influencing the mind of the reader. Now, a little while ago, some of the speakers were saying that there is hardly any translation which does not happen to be the interpretation. So naturally, all these people who were trying to translate the particular text, they are interpreting those particular lines also. So while the first translation and the last one have been faithful to the original Bangla text, there are two translations that have subtly maneuvered the adjectival usage or its lack in stressing the metaphorical darkness of the situation in which the novel begins. For example, Naresh Chandra Sengupta, how does he translate that particular part of the prologue or the introduction? He says, I quote, such was this forest, vast, gloomy, and dense, and the time we were speaking of was midnight, and a very dark night too. Even out of the woods where nothing could be seen. The gloom within the forest was black like the darkness in the womb of the earth. Shri Aurobindo translates this very passage as, in this interminable, impenetrable wilderness of blind gloom, it is night, the hour is midnight, and a very dark midnight. Even outside the woodland, it is dark and nothing can be seen. Within the forest, the piles of gloom are like the darkness of the womb in the earth itself. Rather, the darkness is within the imagination. But inconceivable is that noiseless stillness of the ever murmurous, ever noise filled earth. Barun Kumar Roy has translated it in a different way. He says, it was midnight. On all the sides, darkness enveloped the forest, and the darkness within was the darkness in the womb of the earth. A heavy silence compounded the blackness of this forest. There is still another translation by Julius Lipner. He says, not only in this vital, profoundly dark forest, but it is also late at night, and it is extremely dark night, dark even outside the forest. Nothing is visible, but the mass of gloom within is like the darkness in the very bowels of the earth, and indeed, the darkness of which we speak could be imagined. But that brooding silence of an otherwise clamorous world is beyond conceiving. Now I am told that Bankim uses two words in Bangla text, and both these words are significant. These words in Bangla text happen to be uh, Bhugarbhasto, and the second one happens to be Anubhav. Hmm? So the translation rendered of Bhugarbhasto is the darkness in the womb of the earth, the darkness of the womb of the earth by Aurobindo, and the darkness in the womb of the earth by Roy, and the darkness in the very bowels of the earth by Lipna. And the metaphorical darkness that was a hint at the dependent status of the country uh, is very obvious. The darkness, either of the womb or the bowl, is reminiscent of the source, is reminiscent of the recesses of human body. And the earlier translators were working on the source text during a period of hope for the birth of a nation. And this faith is possibilities of a birth prompted them to keep the idea of womb intact. However, Lipner was working during the first half of the present century in a nation that was already in a state of becoming. So Lipner is hinting at the darkness present in the underbelly of the nation, and is holding it captive to its own ideologies of restriction. And Bankim's use of the word Anubhav has been translated to feel. And the translators use the word within to convey the idea of the physical darkness percolating the inner recesses of the mind. And the need to feel the depth of the darkness is important, as only then can the need of light or being enlightened to be felt very intensity. There is another word, jati, Bengali jati, uh, uh, that needs to be eliminated. Hmm? This darkness within. And the one way to end it was through bhakti. And Sen-Gupta translates bhakti as devotion. Aurobindo translates bhakti as soul's worship, thereby stressing the aspect of spirituality in nationalist thought. B.K. Roy translates this as devotion to be seemingly secular politics. As he hints in the preface, the novel itself had evolved and was playing a part in keeping a number of controversies alive in India today. Hmm? Now, let me move on to the second part uh, because I don't have much time at my disposal. So, let me come to the translation of Bande Matram, the idea of Mother India. Bande, Vande, so Bande Matram. So, in a country that can boast of a goddess of almost every occasion, the construction of a nation as a Devi was the easiest strategy for a secularist person or even for Bankim Chatterjee. And he could generate it as a connection between the idea of India and idea of citizen. I'm also told that in the initial days, when this Durga Puja was started in Bengal, a large number of Muslims also used to take part hmm, in various forms, particularly as Dholwala and all those things, making even the statues, etc. So, and sometimes they also participated in the Durga Puja celebrations. So this idea of worshipping a goddess was not new to the Indian Muslims particularly. Hmm. So Bankim Chandra could have conceived of this secular goddess, Bharat Mata. So he did not create this Bharat Mata as a typically Hindu goddess. Nor do we find the description of this Hindu goddess elsewhere. Elsewhere means in the religious texts, for example, in some Purana, etc. The idea of Bharat is there, but this conceiving of Bharat as Bharat Mata
Uh,
is not something peculiar that is
Hello.
there. Yes, please. Hello.
Can I request you to summarize it?
Okay, please. So I would just like to cite this Bande Mataram Sujalam Sufalam Malaya Shitlam Sasya Shamala Mataram Bande Mataram. Now, this is simply the geographical description of the place, and this translation has been rendered as by Sen Gupta as "Hail the Mother, to her I bow, who with sweetest water overflows, with dainty fruits is rich endowed, the cooling whom the south wind blows, who is green with crops as on her brow, to such a mother down I bow. And Arvindo translation translates this verse as, Mother, I bow to thee, rich with thy hurrying streams, bright with thy orchard gleams, cool with thy winds of delight, dark fields waving, mother of might, mother free. So both of them have tried to translate the novel. Hmm? And both of them have tried to also refer to the partition of Bengal and revoking of that particular thing that had taken place. So this is how various types of translations they not only refer to the historic circumstances, but they also convey the idea that India could be conceived as Bharat Mata, and this could be conceived as a this could be conceived as a secular goddess. Now, this idea, of course, may sound preposterous to some people, but this is what needs to be considered, and the book needs to be reread in this light again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Dhananjay Singh. I hope I'm audible. I hope
Yes,
I'm audible to everyone.
yes, ma'am,
Yes.
you are.
Okay. Honorable Chair, respected Professor Agrawal and delegates present here, research scholars and students, I wish everyone a very good morning. And let me congratulate Professor Agrawal and his team for organizing such a wonderful conference on a very relevant topic, and also thank him for inviting me to this conference as a speaker, though I am not a scholar of translation studies. Thank you so much, Professor Agrawal. The title of my presentation is Negotiating Culture, Role of Translation in
Thank you
Indian
so
Future.
much.
Yeah, I will begin my presentation with a quote from Suzanne Besnet. How do people understand one another when they don't share a common cultural experience? Translation is a hyponymy of intercultural communication or vice versa. Both of them engage and interact with different languages and cultures and invariably share certain similarities of components and features. The concept of translation depends upon how one views language, and it is used to transfer knowledge and culture. Translation theories are premised on two different assumptions about language use. The instrumental concept of language, which considers it as a mode of communication of objective information expressive of thought and meaning, where meaning refers to empirical reality or encompass a pragmatic situation. Secondly, the hermeneutic concept of language, which emphasizes on interpretation, consisting of thought and meaning, where the latter shape reality. This theory privileges interpretation of creative values. In fact, translation is not a merely rendering of words from one language to another, but it is a social act involving social relationship where two cultures come in contact with each other, what Mary Campbell has termed context zone, and get to know about diverse social structures and knowledge system. Similarly, as a branch of social science discipline, intercultural communication is primarily concerned with the blending of culture and communication and how these impact social interaction and understanding. In this communication, it is essential for both the participants to understand the relationship between both the cultures and, like a translator, needs to be fully acquainted with what Samovara Potika has called a set of cultural syndromes. They define them, I quote, as a shared patterns of beliefs, attitudes, self-defined norms, and values organized around a theme, I end quote. Post-structuralist theorists entertain and show their belief in this notion. They consider that culture plays a significant role in the translation of a particular text and has much more precedence over the linguistic element due to its great influence on the translation process. They believe that meaning is a plural and contingent construct, not an unchanging unified essence. Therefore, translation cannot be judged according to mathematics-based concept of semantic equivalence or one-to-one correspondence. I end quote. The translator has to get into the reciprocity of language and reinterpret it in the socio-cultural knowledge and context. According to David Crystal, I quote, there is no task more complex than translation. He further says that translators not only need to know their source language well, they also must also have knowledge about the field of knowledge covered by the source text and of any social, cultural, or emotional connotation that need to be specified in the target language if the intended effect is to be conveyed. The same special awareness needs to be present for the target language so that points of special phrasing, contemporary fashion, or taboos in expression, local expectation, and so on can be all taken into account. Hierarchy and hegemony and cultural dominance are often said to be reflected in translation, especially those which were written during colonial and post-colonial period. Asymmetrical relationship between the target language and the source language and the cultures and intentionality of the translators function as the variables that affect the complete translation process. These are determined by historical and colored social practices. As Cronin notes, I quote, translation relationship between minority and majority languages are rarely divorced from issues of power and identity, that in turn destabilizes universalist ethical prescription on the translation process. I end quote. Furthermore, the process of translation is usually influenced by the translator's own ideological background, intended purpose, and the stance which the translator assumes or holds for the target audience. During colonization, British Raj made all attempts to influence translation activity to suit their own imperialistic agenda and requirements. They tried to mold every sphere in the domain to overall political design. The administration, the judiciary, and seats of higher education institutions were used to propagate their own cultural values. They formed policies to translate Indian classical literature to English and vice versa for strategic cultural appropriation. Schaffner and Tamosgo's claim that ideological influence can manifest themselves in various structural forms of in the target language itself, for the sole purpose of either maximizing the influence of a particular action or mitigating its ways, that as a form of linguistic interface, translation introduces discourse shifts, destabilizes received meanings, creates alternate views of reality, establishes new representation, and makes possible new identities. The translations, especially which were done during colonial and post-colonial period, became a battleground between the hegemonic forces, the target culture and language, and the formerly subjugated non-Western world. As Bassnett notes, all the rewriting, as Professor Dhananjay Singh also said, all the rewritings, whatever their intention, reflect a certain ideology and a politics, and as such manipulate literature to function in a society in a given way. Rewriting is manipulation undertaken in the service of power and its position, and in its positive aspect, it can definitely help in the evolution of literature and society. The translation of foreign texts may also reflect the ideological and political agendas of target and source culture. These views clearly explicate the embeddedness of the ideological implication in the process of translation and how by cultural negotiation the powerful voices can subdue and silence the subservient. The paper proposes to interrogate how translation was used as a subversive strategy and how by appropriation and negotiation of cultural syndrome the colonialist constructed Indian image negatively. It will also discuss how as a counter discourse and response to this, Indian writers adapted both Indian and foreign texts and translated them in regional Indian, English and other languages for wider circulation to revise and correct the Indian image, creating patriotic feeling among Indians and to motivate them to be a part of the Indian freedom struggle. Edward said, rightly says in his work Orientalism, I quote, the translation project explicitly started as a manipulative tool to rule and to learn than to compare the Orient with the Occident, to subdue the infinite variety of the Orient to a complete digest of laws, figures, customs, and works he is believed to have achieved. I am quote. It was considered important to know the Orient in order to dominate colony. In order to establish the superiority of English language, literature and culture, the British translated many European texts into the local Indian languages. They tried to colonize Indian intellectually, culturally, as well as definitely politically. This slow process continued in different phases throughout their rule, and translation project was an important part of this colonizing process. By translating Indian classics, books, literature, and other works, the image of India and its culture was misconstructed and misrepresented as derogatory and subservient. With an aim to further the cause of Oriental research, Sir William Jones founded the Asiatic Society in 1784 in India, but in reality this was again a subversive strategy to tarnish India's image in the world and present its culture as inferior, simple, and uncivilized. As an initiative, he translated Abhigyan Shakuntalam into English and entitled it as The Fatal Ring or Shakuntala in 1789. The text was largely appropriated according to Western aesthetics and did not pay any heed to specificities of Indian culture. Charles Wilkins, another British official, the Commissioner of Revenue, was the first to translate the Bhagavad Gita into English. Macaulay's education policy again was another colonialist agenda which contributed in this. The dispatch and education policy by the East India Company in 1854 clearly mentioned that, I quote, the vernacular literature of India will be gradually uh, unreached by the translation of European books or by the original composition of men whose mind have been imbued with the spirit of European advancement, so that European knowledge may gradually be placed in this manner within the reach of all classes of the people. I end quote. By introducing English as a mode of language, mode of education, they wanted to cultivate a class of people, Indian in blood and culture, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and also in intellect. There were large-scale efforts to translate English books into Indian languages and promote English literature. Many obscure 18th and 19th century English novels were translated to Indian languages. Some of the early novels were written by British women also, with a view to promote the Christian values to Indians. Quite early, there is two examples that I have taken. Quite early in 1852, Hannah Catherine Mullins wrote
One second. Hello. Hello.
Bengali, Mr. Collins, and then it was translated in Malayalam in 1877. These novels had the purpose of educating the native women about the advantages of Christianity. These novels, the Bible was also translated in local languages with dual objectives. First is to teach Christian values to locals and is to strengthen the vernacular languages. The Seramopur Mission Press, which was established in 1800, enlisted Indian experts in different languages to translate the Bible. But these translations radically changed the concept of translation in India, because the Indian tradition of translation was a free adaptation of source material and was really retelling rather than accurate translation. But the Bible changed the scenario, and it emphasized on the need for accurate word for word translation. Fidelity in translation was considered to be of primary concern. The British attempts in translation were mainly determined by Orientalist ideology and need to know the new rulers to grasp, define, categorize, and control India. They created their own versions of India, while the Indian translators of texts into English sought to extend, correct, revise, and sometimes challenge the British understanding. However, the colonial intervention was restricted merely to the translation of Sanskrit and Arabic classics into English, or that of English classics into in certain Indian languages. Significantly, on the other hand, because my speakers were already talking about these translations, Indian creative writers actively engaged in translation and created a parallel counter discourse against the agenda of British colonial power. They defied colonial machinations and registered their protest in the channelized translation activity of literature wherever and whatever Indian languages it existed. Translation during this period became part of larger process of resistance to alien domination and a determining factors in the expression of cultural identity and the reassertion of the native self. As Theo Harmon writes, I quote, cultural communities and groups, they constitute their sense of self in relation to others and by regulating the channels of contact with outside world. End quote. Translation, an important medium of cultural interaction, played a significant role during Indian freedom struggle. It helped in understanding, analyzing, and examining the socio-political aspect of Indian literature and proved as a bridge between different linguistics and cultural communities of India. It functioned as a communication tool and acquainted Indians with literary and creative works of different parts of India. Writers in India at large are bilingual without any conscious efforts or cultivated scholarship. They not only translate books but of other writers. India, with its cultural diversity and multilingualism, carries a rich history of literature and translation. The various versions of classics and masterpieces in diverse languages are the most part recreation with which could even be considered as creation in their way, because translator is a creator also, and occupied important places in the regional literature and were well received by the regional public at the time. Indian history of translation and literature is full of such adaptation throughout the age. Sanskrit epics and Purans have been told, retold, adapted, subverted, appropriated, and translated without concern for fidelity to the source text. In fact, the numerous adaptations of Sanskrit texts in Indian languages have had a unifying influence on the Indian psyche. A rich inventory for the adaptation strategies have been used to describe the process, such as translation, transliteration, transference, anukarna, bhasha rupantar. So there are little bit difference in all these terms, but these are the terms which have been used for Indian translation. Indian traditions always believed in sense and soul translation. Indian literary translation can actually be viewed as a domesticating process. It is a creative process in which the translator may take a source text and adapt it to a dominant politics or ideology to the target culture, or have some specified objective or target readers in their mind. It was only later on, with the arrival of the translation theories, that the translators started looking for equivalence between SLT and TLT. Raja Ram Mohan Roy's translation of Shankara's Vedanta and the Ishopanishads were the first Indian intervention in English translations of Indian texts by Indian scholars. R.C. Dutt translated Rig Veda, the Upanishad, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and few classical Sanskrit plays. All these translations challenged the romantic and utilitarian notion of Indians as submissive and indolent. There were numerous translations by other Indian languages functioning as a nationalist discourse. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anandmat, published in 1882, kindled the fire of the freedom, and it was translated into most of the major Indian languages, and of course in English for 3 times. Aurobindo himself translated this in 1909. Sarachandra Chattopadhyay, his works were translated and published almost in all the Indian languages and had a wider readership all over India. Romesh Chandra Dutt's Bang Vijeta and Bankim's Durgesh Nandini, two Bengali novels, were translated in Hindi by Gadadhar Singh. These interlingual translations were done under the supervision of the noted Hindi writer Bhartendu Harishchandra. He accepted the responsibility of this translation to inspire the militant nationalists of Bengal in the first decade of the 20th century. Many others like Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi, who was closely associated with freedom struggle, he sought inspiration from other languages like German and French. He translated Victor Hugo's 93 in Hindi as Balidan. Victor Hugo's work was written in the historical backdrop of the French Revolution of year 1792. For Vidyarthi, translation was a medium to reach to minds and emotions of the masses. So he modified the text to fulfill the objectives of the translation and to suit the taste of the target readers. He wanted to instill feeling of patriotism in his countrymen. He selected and deleted the portion of the text to achieve the aim. In fact, his translation were more or like free adaptation of the original text. Premchand, the famous Hindi-Urdu writer, translated and told Frank's thighs as Ahankar in Hindi. Bhagwati Charan Verma's Chitralekha was also modeled on Frank's novel and was adapted for film in 1941 and 1964. Indian plays, written, translated, and dramatized in different languages, also played a substantial role in the Indian freedom struggle. Dinabandhu Mitra, who wrote the first play, Neel Darpan, that is Mirror of Indigo, in Bengali, which could be included in the genre of protest. It highlighted the plight and exploitation of Bengali indigo workers by the British planters in a very vivid and heart-rending way. Later on, the poet Michael Madhusudan Dutt translated it into English and titled it as the Indigo Planting Mirror. Anonymously and published it with the support of Reverend James Long. He was a priest, educator, and humanist, and he was sentenced to imprisonment for this sedition. The success of this play motivated other dramatists also to join this legislative act against British injustice. Samandra Darpan, that protested the exploitation of seamen by British ship owners. In Bengal, Girish Chandra Ghosh, he wrote and produced Sirajuddaulah and Mir Qasim, based on historical figures who had suffered British operations. These plays, Sirajuddaulah and Mir Qasim, dramatized the corruption and bribery which were prevalent during British rule in India. These plays indirectly attacked the British government and its policy for banning or censoring a creativity and powerful literature. The medium, which a medium of freedom of expression, has always been a manipulative strategy of the rulers to silence the voice. Theatre and drama, with its performativity aspect, can always impact the thoughts and minds of masses significantly. Hence, it has always been suppressed under the pretext of being scandalous, defamatory, seditious, obscene, or otherwise prejudicial in the public interest. By
Yeah.
introducing dramatic performance control ordinance on 29 February 1876,
If you
the
could
British
uh,
imposed censorship on such dramatic performances.
yeah, Professor, if you could
I'll
conclude.
just complete in a minute. Another playwright, D.L. Roy, explored the past history of India in the plays Rana Pratap, Mewar Patan, The Fall of Mewar, and these all plays focused on the struggle of Rajputs to preserve their independence. In the year 1930, when Bengal prisons were full of political prisoners detained, who were detained for their involvement in Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, Mannat Ray of Bengal dramatized Hindu legend by selecting episodes of the birth of Lord Krishna in prison. Its allegorical significance was not lost on the Bengali audience, and subsequently it also made the same fate and was banned. Traditions like these, with the specific purpose of introducing revolutionary ideas to Indian leaders, were being undertaken in different parts of India. These were more like adaptation with no thought for fidelity to the original, but definitely played a silent but influential role in enhancing the patriotic spirit among Indians. These translations function as the cultural mediators, which have been restructuring perspectives, challenged the existing norms, and introduced the alternative discourses in direct form. This is my presentation, and I thank Professor Agrawal for giving me this opportunity to present my views. Thank you so much.
Thank you.